There's a specific kind of certainty that settles into someone's face right before they cross a person they've badly misjudged. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of that certainty, you know exactly the look. It isn't hesitation. It's the opposite. A kind of relaxed confidence that assumes whatever comes next will unfold according to a familiar script. One where you absorb the harm quietly, the way you apparently always have, and life simply continues on their terms. What they never see coming in that exact moment is that they've just made a calculation based on a version of you that no longer exists, if it ever fully existed at all. This is what we're exploring today, and I want to frame it honestly from the start, because this title tempts a certain kind of fantasy, one built around watching someone finally suffer the way they made you suffer. What we're actually tracing is something more grounded, and in the end, considerably more satisfying than that fantasy, because it doesn't depend on anything happening to them at all. It depends entirely on what happens inside you. Once someone crosses a line they assumed would cost them nothing, and discovers, often too late to do anything about it, exactly how wrong that assumption was. Let's start with understanding why people make this kind of mistake in the first place, because it's rarely random, and it's almost never based on nothing. Remember what we've traced throughout this entire series about how narcissistic psychology tends to calibrate its understanding of who can be pushed and who can't, watching for fast trust, watching for guilt responsiveness, watching for difficulty tolerating disappointment. Someone who crosses you badly, in a way that eventually becomes their biggest mistake, has almost always done so based on an accurate read of how you've behaved before, not a random miscalculation, but a reasonable extrapolation from a genuine pattern you'd shown them repeatedly, sometimes for years. This is worth sitting with honestly, because it isn't an accusation. It's simply the mechanics of how these situations actually unfold. If you absorbed disrespect quietly in the past, if you gave chance after chance, if you softened boundaries the moment they produced any visible discomfort in someone else, the person now crossing you built their entire calculation on exactly that evidence. Their mistake isn't that they misread you randomly. Their mistake is that they assumed the pattern was permanent, a fixed feature of your character rather than a temporary accommodation you'd eventually outgrow, the same way water assumes a container's shape only until it finds an opening large enough to escape through entirely. Let's talk about what actually happens in the specific moment someone crosses this particular line, the one that eventually becomes their biggest mistake rather than simply another incident you absorb and move past. This moment rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It's often something that viewed in isolation doesn't appear significantly different from 100 smaller transgressions that came before it. But something internal shifts differently this time, and understanding this shift matters, because it explains why some crossings produce lasting consequence, while others simply become one more entry in a long, exhausting list. Here's what's actually happening underneath the surface. Every previous accommodation you made wasn't actually erased or forgotten. It accumulated quietly into something we might call a threshold, an internal ledger that keeps track of cost even when conscious attention is focused elsewhere, on managing the relationship day to day. This particular crossing, the one that finally triggers real consequence, isn't necessarily worse in an objective sense than everything that came before it. It's simply the one that happens to land after the threshold has already been reached, the final addition to a sum that's been building for far longer than the person crossing you ever bothered to notice or calculate. This is worth understanding as the actual mechanism behind why their mistake becomes their biggest one specifically, rather than just another moment in an ongoing pattern. They weren't crossing a person with infinite tolerance. They were crossing a person whose tolerance had a limit they never accurately measured, because measuring it would have required paying attention to something they'd trained themselves not to notice. The actual cost their behavior was accumulating in you, invisible until the exact moment it finally became visible in a way they could no longer explain away or manage back into submission. Let's talk about what happens next, because this is where the actual consequence begins to take shape, and it's considerably different from what most revenge fantasies imagine. It doesn't usually involve a dramatic confrontation, though it can. What it almost always involves, first and most fundamentally, is a genuine internal recalibration on your side, one that has nothing to do with punishing them and everything to do with finally accurately updating your own understanding of what this relationship actually costs you and what you're actually willing to keep paying for it going forward. This recalibration is worth understanding as the real beginning of their mistakes' consequences, even though it happens entirely privately, often invisible to them for considerably longer than you'd expect. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about what actually threatens narcissistic stability most deeply. Not anger, not confrontation, but genuine, settled change that doesn't require their permission or their awareness in order to be real. This recalibration is exactly that. It doesn't ask their opinion. It doesn't wait for their acknowledgement. It simply begins quietly, the moment the threshold has genuinely been crossed, and it continues unfolding from that point forward, regardless of whether they ever notice it happening at all. What we haven't yet explored is what this recalibration actually looks like in practice, how it transforms from an internal shift into visible, undeniable consequence, and why the specific way this consequence unfolds, slowly, without their cooperation, and completely outside their ability to manage or reverse it, is exactly what makes it considerably more devastating than anything they could have anticipated when they made the calculation that led them here in the first place. Let's talk about how this internal recalibration actually transforms into visible, undeniable consequence, because the gap between the private shift we discussed at the end of Part 1 and its eventual outward expression is worth understanding precisely, since it explains why this particular mistake often takes considerably longer to fully register than the person who made it ever anticipated. Here's what typically happens first, and it's worth naming because it's easy to miss if you're looking for something more dramatic. A subtle change in what you're willing to explain. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how explanation functions as a kind of engagement, a signal that someone's opinion still carries enough weight to warrant justification. Once the threshold has genuinely been crossed, this willingness to explain tends to quietly disappear, not through any announced decision, but simply because the internal recalibration has already concluded that further explanation isn't worth the cost it used to seem worth. This absence is often the first visible sign of the mistake's actual consequences, though it's frequently misread by the person who caused it, interpreted as a temporary mood rather than what it actually represents. A genuine, structural shift in how much access they still have to your reasoning. Let's talk about the second visible sign, one that tends to follow shortly after the first and carries considerably more weight. A change in what gets tolerated during ordinary, everyday interaction. This is worth understanding as distinct from dramatic confrontation because it usually doesn't announce itself as a boundary being drawn. It simply appears as a kind of quiet unwillingness to absorb behavior that would have previously been met with patience, accommodation, or the benefit of the doubt. A comment that once would have been let go now gets met with silence that clearly isn't agreement. A request that once would have been fulfilled automatically now gets met with a simple, unexplained no. None of this requires raised voices or dramatic declarations. It simply requires the internal shift we discussed in Part 1, finally beginning to express itself outwardly, in small, consistent, cumulative ways. This is worth understanding as genuinely disorienting for the person experiencing it, precisely because it doesn't match any single moment they can point to as the cause. Remember what we discussed regarding the threshold not being about any single incident being uniquely severe, but about accumulated cost finally reaching its limit. This means the consequence, when it finally becomes visible, often feels, to the person who caused it, disconnected from anything specific enough to argue with or apologize for directly. They sense something has changed, but they can't locate the exact moment or the exact cause because the actual cause was never a single moment at all. It was the accumulation itself, finally reaching its expression, and this diffuseness makes the consequence considerably harder for them to address, precisely because there's no single identifiable mistake they can point to and correct in order to restore the old dynamic. Let's talk about a third and considerably more significant sign, one that tends to emerge once enough time has passed for the recalibration to fully stabilize. A genuine redirection of your energy, attention, and investment toward people and pursuits that have nothing to do with them at all. This is worth understanding as the deepest and most consequential expression of everything we've traced throughout this exploration, because it represents something considerably more permanent than withheld explanation or reduced tolerance for specific behaviors. It represents an actual reallocation of the resource that mattered most throughout the entire relationship. Your attention, your care, your genuine investment, moving decisively away from them and toward a life that no longer requires their participation in order to feel complete. This redirection is worth understanding as the point where their mistake genuinely becomes what this exploration's title describes, their biggest one, because everything before this point was still, in some sense, recoverable. Withheld explanation could theoretically be restored through genuine, sustained effort on their part. Reduced tolerance for specific behaviors could theoretically shift back if the underlying behavior genuinely changed. But once genuine redirection has occurred, once your attention and investment have actually structurally moved elsewhere, restoring the previous dynamic requires something considerably harder to achieve. Not just improved behavior, but genuine reason for you to redirect your attention back toward them. A reason that has to compete against everything you've already successfully built without them in the meantime. Here's what's worth understanding about why this specific consequence tends to land so much harder than anything more dramatic or confrontational could ever manage to achieve. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about what narcissistic psychology depends on for its own stability, ongoing confirmation of significance in the emotional world of people who matter to them. Genuine redirection of your attention doesn't confirm this significance through negation, the way anger or confrontation would, by still centering them as the subject worth reacting to. It confirms the opposite quietly and completely by demonstrating that your emotional world has genuinely reorganized itself around things and people that don't include them, that their absence from the center of your attention isn't a temporary punishment waiting to be lifted, but a genuine structural shift that happened as a natural consequence of what they did, not as a strategy deployed specifically to make them suffer. This distinction matters enormously, and it's worth naming directly before we move into the final part of this exploration. The fact that this redirection wasn't designed as punishment is precisely what makes it function as the most severe consequence available. A punishment implies an audience, implies the punished party's reaction as part of the intended outcome. Genuine redirection implies nothing of the sort. It simply happens for your own sake, entirely independent of whether they notice, understand, or suffer as a result of it at all, and this independence, this complete absence of any requirement that they witness or acknowledge what's happened, is exactly what makes it impossible for them to argue with, negotiate against, or strategically reverse. This brings us to the final and most important part of this exploration, the one where we need to bring together everything we've traced about threshold, recalibration, and redirection into a single, coherent understanding of what it actually means for someone to wish, genuinely and permanently, that they had never crossed you in the first place, and why this particular kind of regret, unlike anything performed or demanded, tends to be the only kind that's ever actually real. Let's bring everything together now, because this is where we need to address what this exploration's title actually means once it's fully understood, rather than left as a satisfying but vague promise. What does it actually look like for someone to wish, genuinely and permanently, that they had never crossed you? And why does this specific kind of regret, built from threshold, recalibration, and redirection, function so differently from anything that could ever be demanded, performed, or extracted through confrontation? Here's the first thing worth understanding clearly. This regret, when it's genuine, rarely arrives as a single moment of realization. It accumulates the same way the original threshold accumulated, slowly, through repeated exposure to evidence that keeps confirming the same uncomfortable conclusion. Every time they notice your withheld explanation, every time they encounter your reduced tolerance for behavior that used to work reliably, and especially every time they witness, directly or through secondhand information, the genuine redirection of your life toward things and people that don't include them, another piece of confirmation lands, slowly building toward a recognition they never wanted to reach and, in most cases, never fully articulate even to themselves. This is worth understanding as genuinely different from the regret people often imagine when picturing this kind of consequence. The dramatic, tearful realization delivered directly to you, the moment where they finally say the words you've been waiting to hear. That version, satisfying as it might be to imagine, requires their continued engagement, their continued awareness of you as the person whose forgiveness or understanding still matters. What we're actually describing requires none of this. It's a private, often unspoken recognition, one that doesn't need your witness in order to be real, and one that, precisely because it doesn't need your witness, tends to be considerably more honest than anything performed for an audience could ever manage to be. Let's talk about why this private, unwitnessed regret matters more than any performed version could, because this connects directly to something we've traced throughout this entire series about the difference between engagement and genuine consequence. A performed apology, a dramatic confrontation where they finally admit their mistake, still requires your continued presence, your continued attention, your continued willingness to serve as the audience for their reckoning. This requirement means the reckoning, however satisfying it might feel in the moment, still functions as a form of engagement, still keeps some portion of the dynamic oriented around you being available to receive it. Private, genuine regret requires none of this. It simply exists, whether or not you're ever aware of it, whether or not it's ever spoken aloud. And this independence from your continued availability is precisely what makes it the more complete and more permanent form of consequence. Here's the deepest insight worth carrying forward from everything we've traced across this entire exploration, one that finally answers the question this title poses directly. Their biggest mistake was never really about a single crossing, a single incident severe enough to warrant this exploration's dramatic framing. Their biggest mistake was believing the pattern they'd observed in you was permanent, that the accommodation, the patience, the tolerance they'd grown accustomed to extracting represented a fixed feature of who you are, rather than a temporary state they were fortunate enough to benefit from for as long as it lasted. Every person who has ever badly misjudged someone this way has made essentially this same error, mistaking patience for permanence, mistaking accommodation for a permanent feature of someone's character rather than a resource that, like any resource, has genuine limits. This is worth understanding as something considerably more valuable than a satisfying fantasy about someone else's downfall, because it reveals something important about your own trajectory that has nothing to do with them at all. The threshold you reached, the recalibration that followed, and the genuine redirection of your attention toward a life that no longer requires their participation, none of this was actually built as a weapon aimed at them. It was built as the natural, healthy result of finally accurately valuing your own tolerance as a finite resource rather than an infinite one, of finally recognizing that patience extended indefinitely, without any corresponding change in the behavior it was meant to accommodate, isn't virtue. It's simply cost, absorbed quietly for far longer than it should have been. So if there's one thing worth carrying forward from everything we've traced across this entire exploration, let it be this. You don't need to witness their regret in order to trust that it's real. And you don't need to spend any further energy wondering whether they've finally understood what they lost. Whatever recognition eventually reaches them, whenever it arrives, however completely or incompletely they ever manage to articulate it, belongs entirely to them now, unfolding according to its own timeline, requiring nothing further from you in order to be genuine. What actually matters, what was always going to matter considerably more than their eventual regret, is the life you built once you finally recalibrated, the boundaries that finally held, the attention that finally redirected toward people and pursuits that actually deserved it, that life was never contingent on their reckoning arriving at all. It was always, from the very moment the threshold was reached, entirely and permanently yours, regardless of whether they ever fully understood exactly what they lost the day they mistook your patience for something that would last forever.